Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Justin Terrell. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Justice Research Center. Our organization, the MNJRC, our mission is to transform the criminal legal system. As you know, we don't believe that we currently have a justice system. We are excited to work with as many community members and advocates across the state of Minnesota to ensure that we align the system with values shared by Minnesotans across the state, so that we can actually put forth a real justice system. We focus on research, education, and policy development. And part of this conversation today is so important because, as many of you know, that we've been having this discussion about restorative justice in community for a while now. There's been several articles in the Star Tribune. There's a lot of folks across the state who are providing services and services that are restorative, but also diversion as well. And we wanted to lead this conversation during our conference this past year. Now, we weren't able to host it, so we decided to make sure we create space and community to have it today. And so I'm really thankful for everyone to join us, to hear from Representative Feist, from our good friend, Dr. Raj, and Beau RaRa, who are all on the front lines of leading opportunities to expand restorative justice. And I'll just close with this. We had a big victory this week with restoration of voting rights, which is an example of not like true restorative justice as you may have seen on like indigenous communities and whatnot, but the idea of restoring voting rights to people, the idea of saying that what your experience in the criminal legal system should influence how we choose our leaders to govern the legal system. That act of restoration is also part of this conversation. And I just want to be clear that justice, as we like to look at it in the at the Minnesota Justice Research Center, is really focused on not punishment at all, but really focusing on being fair, equitable, holding people accountable, holding systems accountable, and that whenever possible, seeking restorative outcomes. That is, we're not just letting people wander around broken, like an eye for an eye, everyone would be blind. That's not justice to us. Justice to us is making sure that people have pathways to heal, pathways to get as far back closer to right relationship as possible. And so with that, just sharing a little bit of our philosophy, I just want to reiterate how thankful I am for all of you joining us today. The MNJRC is conducting research on this topic. We are going to be speaking out publicly, advising legislators on policies that are moving through the session this year. And hopefully we'll be having many more conversations like this. And so you have all my gratitude for being here with us. Sorry we couldn't be in person. Will, thank you for facilitating today and the support from Metro State in pulling this conversation together. Thank you so much. And I will turn it over to Will.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, we wanted to be in person, but Metro State said they were going to decide at 6 a.m. this morning whether their buildings were going to be open. So we thought we better shift to online. So a couple house cleaning items. This Zoom is being recorded. For those of you here for CLE credits, the CLE credits have been applied for and are pending. And then the chat monitor today is Patrick Nolan from Minnesota Justice Research Center. Patrick, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, my name is Patrick Nolan. I work with and for the Minnesota Justice Research Center. I got my bachelor's at the University of Minnesota in sociology of law. So I'm justice impacted, spent 3 years in prison, and more than that if you consider my time in the juvenile system. So this is a very important topic to me, both personally and professionally, and I look forward to working with all of you or listening to you and dialoguing about these topics. Thank you.
Great. Patrick, if you could do the admitting as folks come into the waiting room, that would be great. And then he will be monitoring the chat. If something comes up during our speakers, just go ahead and throw it in the chat and we'll get to your questions after all three speakers have presented. So again, restorative justice, historical context, policy, and systems transformation. We have 3 speakers, Dr. Raj, Beau RaRa, and Representative Sandra Feist. So we're going to start with Dr. Raj. I'll introduce him. Dr. Raj is a recovering criminologist, alcoholic, and survivor of sexual abuse, with over 20 years of community-based activism as a researcher and educator. Inspired by the resilience of our youth and the people in our prison systems, he trains school staff, probation agents, community members, and justice personnel on restorative practices, trauma and healing, value-centered leadership, community building, and unpacking implicit biases. Dr. Raj will speak for about 12 minutes before we turn it over to the next speaker. So go ahead, Dr. Raj.
So we're going to descend to all these stuff and really invite all of you to turn on your cameras, if you will, right? If you will. Latanya, how you doing? Right. Sister is in the house. Want to invite all of us. Thank you for waving. Yes, I appreciate that. Y'all turn on your cameras and let's come on into this space, because we don't want to start this process like an agenda driven, right? This is not a colonial practice. We want you to be invested and practice what we are saying in terms of what we call restorative transformative practices. So towards that end, let me invite all of you to stand up, sit down, right? Gently close your eyes and take a couple of deep breaths, right? Let us center our body and our feelings and our presence in this space. So if you will, take a couple of deep breaths, right? Breathe in and breathe out. Breathe in and breathe out. So as you breathe in and breathe out, right? I want to gently invite you to just check in with your body, right? How are you feeling, right? Are you feeling frustrated, angry? Are you settled? Did you have a good breakfast, right? Just kind of remember and remind yourself how your body is showing up in this space. So as you breathe in and breathe out, I want to gently invite us to also feel our feet on the ground, right? As you place your feet on the ground, feel it like you have never felt the ground underneath your feet. I want to invite us to take this time to acknowledge that we are standing on stolen lands, right? And we want to honor the original stewards of this land, the Anishinaabe communities, the Dakota communities who come in all forms, shapes, right? The stewards of this land and the many generations of communities who are here with us, right? Who are here with us. We want to honor them for being the stewards of this land and also the stewards of this practice today we call restorative justice, right? We want to honor them and also want to take this time to honor the stewards as you breathe in and breathe out, the stewards of the stolen bodies, right? Bodies that were stolen and raped and exposed to all kinds of trauma, right? In the name of advancing this economy, the stewards of the stolen bodies from the continent of Africa. Want to honor them and their many contributions, and also the many generations of Black community who are here with us. So as you breathe in and breathe out, want to honor the stewards of the stolen bodies and stewards of this land and the practice, and also honor yourself, right? Be present, check in with your body, see how you're feeling, where you are emotionally. I want to invite you also to get out of your headspace, right? Get out of your headspace, right? And come into your heart and your body, right? And stay there throughout this time we are together. So as you breathe in and breathe out, I want to gently invite you to open your eyes as your camera is on, smile at people, right? Let some of that happy juices out, that oxytocin in your body, release it, infect the space, right? Albeit it's cyber, nevertheless, right? I know 12 minutes, I have no idea what I'm doing in terms of time, but I want to just take a quick moment to remind ourselves, right? When we say restorative practices, we often in this economic world that we are in this sort of materialistic, right, capitalistic society we are in, there's always a value placed on restorative practices, right? And when I hear conversations about restorative practices, I hear, especially in times of crisis, is it a zero-sum game? Do we have restorative practices and replace all these other practices, right? There's always this tension. In the latest incident at Harding, I heard a parent stood up and said, right, in all of their spirit of searching for the wellness of their child in the school, they started to question, what is this thing called restorative practices, and why is it that kids are not being expelled, right, or suspended? And I've heard that same call, right, from the father of one of the child who was shot in the Florida shooting, right, at the Republican convention, right, in 2016, right, stood up and asked that question about what is this thing called restorative practices, and how are we allowing people, dangerous people, back in school, right? So there are a lot of political challenges to a practice that is far more rooted in history, in culture, in communities before the arrival of the European models of how we work with, right, crime and harm. So the history of this practice is wedded in many indigenous cultures, both here in the United States, in this Turtle Island, as the indigenous communities call it, as well as in the continent of Africa, and also in various parts of the continent of Asia, right? This practice has roots, but those roots have been sort of dismantled because of the urgency of capitalism and the infusion of how capitalistic societies wanted to imagine how societies are supposed to operate. And if somebody violates a certain rule, he or she or they will have to be removed in order for us to maintain stability and control, right? The urgency for control, the need to protect people's wealth and property, right? All of these things led us to create a system we call, right, today, criminal justice system, right? And yet, the history of this practice that we are about to indulge in and talk about has roots that goes back thousands of years, that has always considered, right, in the Dakota language, in the Lakota language, they often refer to kids as spiritual beings, right? If you go to different parts of Kenya, they often, when all of these Kenyan communities, especially the Maasai warriors, when they are interacting with each other, right, they don't ask how you are doing. They look at each other and say, how are the children? Right? How are our children doing? Right? So there are so many different lessons from various parts of these cultures that have been lost in the translation when we were ingested with colonial models, especially settler colonial models that have disenfranchised us connecting with our bodies and wanted us to stay in our headspace. And when you stay in your headspace, you can justify anything. You can justify locking people up and throwing the keys away. You can justify suspending, right, 3.1 million kids on average throughout the school system. You can justify expelling 110,000 kids, right? Those of us who love to watch football, right? How many of us watch Super Bowl, right? Come on, y'all, give it up, right? We all like to watch men in tight pants run around some stupid ball, right? That's fine, right? But isn't that right, Leah? Leah's like, nah, I'm not even getting into it. Whatever, Leah. So it's like, it's not about that, right? But imagine, right, all of those stadiums, football stadiums, you can fit every one of these kids we are suspending in all of these stadiums. That's how many kids we are suspending on a regular basis in the name of what? Control, in the name of safety, right? We're disenfranchising them from the educational experience they're supposed to have. And then engaging our teachers, right? And not imposing this and widening their net on a regular basis and saying, here's another theory. Here's another thing we want you to do. Stop net widening, right? In criminal justice, we call it net widening theory, right? Why are we widening their theory without really releasing them to be able to do relational work in schools, right? They may be subject matter expert, right? But they also want to have relationships. And how do we enhance that relationship before things get crazy, right? So all of those things are part and parcel of what we call restoring, restoration, right? This is not, restorative practices is never meant to come in only to deal with as an alternative to the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is only about 500 years old. Restorative practices is thousands of years old wisdom, right? Let us not juxtapose these practices, right? This is a pure capitalistic, right, settler colonial notion of like, let's juxtapose these things and then see, compare and contrast. No, get out of my face, right? This is not the time to juxtapose those things. This is time to invest in our community, right? Will, how am I doing with time?
About 1 minute left.
Whatever, Will. I knew he was going to say that. Right, Kelly? So this is not the time to do that, y'all. This is the time to invest, right? When we spend $96 million on maintaining a police department that has 150 years of violation, right, MPD, right, of human rights and community civil rights and many other ways, right? How do we decenter them? That's the question I want to ask, right? How do we decenter law enforcement? How do we decenter law enforcement in St. Paul that is what has 1/3 of the city budget, right? In Brooklyn Center, where they're spending 40% of their city budget in law enforcement. What does all these say to us about how we look at our fellow citizens in our communities, right? There is no investment in building and encouraging and normalizing greatness in our communities. So I want to invite us to think about restorative practices as doing groundwork, right? In the book, Inflamed, Raj Patel, Rupert Mero, right, talk about this idea of like doing deep medicine work and not colonial medicine, right? Colonial medicine is tending to fixing things. Deep medicine tends to heal, right? So let us think about and imagine a world where we can invest in healing work, right? And transformational work and not simply fixing the damn system. With that, I'll shut up.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raj. Much appreciated. Our next speaker is Beau RaRa. Beau RaRa is a poet, lawyer, restorative practitioner.
Come on, y'all, give it up.
An
Give it
addict
up
in
for Beau,
recovery.
y'all. Come on. There you go. Love it.
Beau believes in the power of relationships to transform society. Equal parts learner and educator, Beau believes that youth are the experts of their own lives. As an advocate for system change, Beau is the Youth Restorative Justice Initiative Lead at the Legal Rights Center. They partner with restorative practitioners, system stakeholders, and researchers to expand restorative options in the legal system. Go ahead, Beau.
Thanks for the introduction, Will. Thanks for always bringing such powerful energy, even remotely, Dr. Raj. I'm really excited to be here with you all, and your opening did help me kind of drop more into my body, even though we're having to be in this digital space. I think a few things that I'll add before trying to think of what to add to the grounding and like everything that Dr. Raj just said is that like I'm an addict and I'm a cycle breaker. And before I went into law school, I kind of fell into after school programming and not really knowing that I, was trying to save like earlier versions of myself or my siblings. And I imagine that a lot of you are here for reasons that like connect to some place of woundedness in yourself. So my title is very technical sounding, and it's very embedded in system language. And I would say that where I would join with what Dr. Raj is saying is that I see this as a return to culture. And this idea, all the things that you were saying about resources and looking at where they're going is operating from like a fear and scarcity rather than the abundance that like we have everything we need. So my role from like a legal framework and as somebody who can open doors because I have some letters after my name in certain ways, is looking at the different decision points of the school to prison pipeline and figuring out how to get into the space and reduce harm caused by the system by having community-based circle keepers hold space and have an accountability process. That's the value that when I'm meeting with people who work in systems, I'm like, we have a shared value around accountability. We just have a different idea about how we want to get there. It's not about a lack of accountability. So examples of what this looks like here at the Legal Rights Center, we partner with a variety of school districts. We partner with the Hennepin County Attorney's Office around truancy. And actually in the last few years have gotten to the place where at a certain level of truancy, they're not petitioning anymore. So they're stopping that harm of pulling youth and families into a court system. For attendance is like, could mean anything, right? There could be so many needs under why a young person is not making it to school. And a restorative process creates an opportunity to let a young person and their family lead that conversation and say what's really going on, and identify what the goals are that they have and then what their concerns are, and then get everybody in that space to make a commitment. It's not just about that young person being accountable to the adults in their life, it's how are those adults going to be accountable to that young person. The second decision point that we partner with is law enforcement. So there's a collaborative of restorative practitioners. Some people who are part of this partnership, Cara Beckman, are in the space. So we looked at data from 2014 to 2018 when we provided a restorative process with community-based circle keepers. Youth were 2.5 times less likely to be arrested in the next year. And then if you want to make it financial, when these cases have been diverted to a restorative process, because diversion and restorative practices are not the same thing, right? There's a lot of different practices, like Dr. Raj was saying. There's a cost or a savings of $2.63 million when diverted, like the ones that we didn't divert, but like saving $1.62 million with the 745 cases from that time. The ones that weren't diverted were 1,207. So just looking at like financially and in terms of our resources and where we want to be putting them into our communities, as well as that systems contact. We use evaluation because that is, I feel like the colonial requirement, although I would push back on how we ask new things, which aren't, right? It's a return to culture to be better than what exists. So sometimes I feel like the evaluation question it's important because we want to be accountable and we want to make sure racial equity is happening. And that was part of that partnership with MPD was who's even getting diversion. And we were able to reduce the racial disparities at that decision point, as well as look at the outcomes and make sure that the spaces we're holding are accountable to those outcomes too. Let's see. I also just want to acknowledge people who have been mentoring me in my process. So like Chris Mendez, Sam Colton, Dr. Talia Tolfree, Dr. Raj, Malika Iban, our interim executive director, and Chelsea Schmidt-Skillum. Feels really important to acknowledge the people who are mentoring, because I think that's also what's sometimes missing when we try to systematize these things is how does this get passed down? It's an organic relational practice. And so it's not a program. Okay, I'm like hopping around, but so I talked about our truancy partnership. Then the next decision point in this pipeline where as a part of this process, we're looking at partnering is with post-charge, because every youth deserves access to restorative option, not just elementary schoolers, so that we get it right with the next generation. We need to meet kids wherever they are. So we partner at Hennepin County Probation, the Youth Restorative Justice Disposition Program. So probation officers are actually a part of the circle, but they are not facilitating it. We have community-based circle keepers through the Restorative Justice Community Action and Koinonia Leadership Academy, Dr. Tollfree. And so that's enough, we're not eliminating the record at that point, and also that young person is still getting an opportunity to have a meaningful accountability process, and then potentially get that dismissed at the end, depending on how that goes. And what's really powerful about that is that the judge is actually ordering only the restorative process, with the exception of the community service hours for gun cases. These are really serious harms. They are the harms that people talk about when they want to deny restorative practices. Minnesota's already using restorative practices with some of the most serious harms. So I just really like to highlight that too. It's just when we decide they're worthy. So it seems like deeper system involvement, we're willing to take that risk because we've got the punitive hands on. And so I would encourage us to look at the whole legacy of restorative practices in Minnesota, which, as Dr. Raj says, predate the punitive system, but also just since the carceral system, we are using some of these practices and know that we get good outcomes. And then the last place is my colleague Chris Mendez is holding circles at juvenile detention facilities. So that's the continuum. And then a lot of my work looks like starting conversations with community to be like, hey, here's what we're doing here. Obviously your community is different, but what could it look like here? And starting to facilitate spaces in a restorative way, rather than feeling like you have to know when you go into a conversation, which has been a humbling learning for myself too. I don't need to have the answer when I go and talk to a new county attorney, and I can help model that so they don't feel like they need to know or that they need to tell someone what's about to happen, but they explore, how are we going to partner around this? What are the values that are driving this conversation? How am I doing on time?
How about 2 minutes left?
2 minutes. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I really would just call my work harm reduction. There's other people who are doing abolition work. And we'll continue to evaluate to hold ourselves accountable, and also want to really emphasize that sometimes systems are asking for recidivism data when their own internal metric is 2 years. And I'm like, okay, so you want something 6 months out from case closure, and that doesn't track. So let's not ask these practices to be more accountable than what we know isn't working out of fear. And how can we move from like a place of trust? Because you only find out if something's trustworthy by trusting it, and you have to be vulnerable. And restorative practices really model that vulnerability is strength, and the adults have to be able to do that. If we don't do that together, we won't be able to model it for young people, and it will fail because we're not being restorative with each other. So that's just like a call to the adults in the space to trust and feel like they've really made like a good faith effort before getting scared and closing things off, because it's not an elimination of all harm. It's about healing, like Dr. Raj has said.
All right, very good. Yeah, we'll hold those questions. We have one more speaker, but yeah, thank you. Folks have questions, please do put them into the chat. So thank you very much, Beau. Appreciate you going through kind of the mechanics, so we can understand what exactly restorative justice is. I think that comes up a lot, right? There's probably not one definition, but we get that question a lot. So our last speaker is Sandra Feist. Representative Sandra Feist was elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives in 2020. She is also a practicing immigration attorney in the legislature. She is focused on reforming our legal systems to be more just, fully and equitably funding our public schools, and supporting immigrant communities. Representative Feist.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here. I see a number of people that I know and respect, so very excited to have this opportunity to share my thoughts. And I would like to thank Beau and Dr. Raj and Kara Beckman, who have been kind of my mentors and the people that I turn to as I've been trying to do good work in the legislature. Because as Will said, I am not a subject matter expert. I'm an immigration attorney, but I'm also a former board member of the ACLU for a while. And I really, when I went into the legislature, I did want to focus on just making our systems more just. So yeah. My path to restorative justice was different than our other speakers. I really hadn't heard much about it before I was in the legislature. I was aware of the Veterans Restorative Justice Act as something that people were trying to pass. And then when I got elected, the previous author of that bill asked me if I could step in because I'm an attorney. And he's like, there are a lot of lawyer issues coming up and I don't know what to do with it. So it was just, I happened to be in the office that day and my colleague asked me to take this bill and I was like, yeah. And it was through working with experts and sitting in on veterans treatment court hearings and seeing restorative justice in action, talking with my testifiers, that I really came to understand the power of restorative justice. And that bill passed into law, which is very exciting. And during my first year in the legislature, as I was working on that bill, experts like Beau's colleague or former colleague, Sarah Davis, came and spoke to this bipartisan, bicameral public safety working group I was on, talking a lot about youth justice and about restorative justice. And so I decided, well, we've done veterans restorative justice, and like my dream is like all restorative justice, but you start like politically, it was a very we were able to start with veterans because there's a lot of bipartisan interest in supporting veterans. And I was like, well, next we'll just, we'll transplant that bill onto youth and we'll call it a day. And it turned out it was way more complicated than that. But yeah, so sorry, I want to stay in order of my little outline. But that was how I came to restorative justice legislation and became very passionate about it. And like, again, like meeting with experts like Beau and Dr. Raj and Kara Beckman, who's here, just helped to educate me and help to conceptualize how we would want to approach youth restorative justice legislation in Minnesota. So just a few bills to be aware of. So House File 46 is the bill that I've been working on with Beau and Dr. Raj and Kara and a bunch of other brilliant people. And that is to create an Office of Juvenile Restorative Justice, we're calling it. And I will talk, I guess I'll just explain it briefly. It's like the effort is to create kind of a mandate and a framework for youth restorative justice statewide without being prescriptive. And like Beau and Dr. Raj were saying, like we don't want it to just be like, this is an alternative to the, like criminal legal system. Like we want just restorative practices to proliferate for youth statewide. And so it's been a pretty complicated task, but that is the goal and we continue to work on it. House File 1712 is a bill that I've been working on with Senator Bobby Joe Champion. And that is a bill to invest deeply in preventative and intervention type grants and programming. So mental health, trauma services, chemical dependency, domestic violence, recreational activities, just targeting those types of supports for at-risk youth. And it's really like an alternative to this idea that the only answer is to lock kids up or to punish them better. And so I was going to mention, and I'll put my info in chat, but if anyone wants to provide letters of support or is interested in testifying, we're hearing that bill next Thursday, and I want it to be like big and exciting and a real powerful counterpoint to that narrative that we need to like do better at locking kids up and tracking them with data. Like the answer is we need to track kids better. So I'm trying to like push back on that narrative. So that's House File 1712. House File 1048 is just dramatically increasing funding for YIPA, Youth Intervention Prevention Grants, YIP grants. So that kind of overlaps with 1712. And then I'm working on a bill for more youth restorative grants. I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. And then Cedric Frazier has a bill, House File 25, that also incorporates funding for restorative justice and just looking more at sustained and substantial investment in community-based programming. As a counterpoint to you, I think Dr. Raj said, and I should know, 96 million or however absurd amount of money we put into like traditional law enforcement as the only idea around like the only way we can approach public safety investment. So that's a bit about legislation. How am I doing for time? I wasn't paying any attention when I started. Am I good?
You're good. You got about 5 minutes. Yep.
Okay, perfect. And so I wanted to talk about some of the challenges around legislating around restorative justice and then reasons that we should be optimistic. So one of the challenges is linguistic. There are terms that have inherent meaning within statute that are not restorative. And so trying to draft legislation that is like clear and actionable, that doesn't use harmful language, is really hard. And so we are working on that and trying to find a way to do that in a way that's true to the values of what we're trying to accomplish, but also clear to the stakeholders that we want to do what we want them to do. Just some people are really pedantic about language. Like, for example, like the word victim, like some stakeholders are like, we have to have that word, otherwise it's not like victim centered, even though it can be. We don't have to use that word. And so there's just like a lot of linguistic tensions that are really challenging to navigate. Resistance to change. People don't like change. So getting stakeholders to give up power. I guess that's my second one, but it's related. Just trying to get, prosecutors and judges to give up their power and to do things differently. And like Beau was saying, to be vulnerable, to say like, this is better. We don't know exactly, what the future holds, but we know that the current system is unjust and ineffective and racist. But getting like those system stakeholders to like give up their power to do things differently is a massive challenge. So that is an interesting part of this. Needing to trust in imperfect institutions is another challenge. When people are going to the system, like that's a certain type of person, that's a certain type of mindset. And I think in a lot of ways, it's kind of antithetical to what restorative justice is. And yet we're trying to create something that will be statewide, that is actionable, that will work as we intended it. And then we need to trust in those system stakeholders, those agencies, to do it right. And that is an inherent tension in what we are trying to do with our legislation, and continues to be a challenge. I don't like, these are all challenges. I don't have answers to them. They're just like what I see happening as we're trying to do this well. And I think political dynamics and shifts, obviously, one of the reasons that I love restorative justice is I'm always looking for this like Venn diagram of like bipartisan, but also meaningful and like revolutionary, which there aren't a lot of those. Like that Venn diagram doesn't intersect a lot, but I think restorative justice is one of those places. And so I'm excited by the political opportunity to get bipartisan support for this type of work. But that's always shifting. And one of the things that I was thinking of as the other speakers were speaking is that one of my Republican colleagues said in Public Safety Committee recently, the primary and almost exclusive role of our criminal legal system is punitive. And I was just like, how do you work with that? But then I heard that person is interested in working in protecting the civil liberties of sex offenders. So I'm like, maybe it was just talk. I don't know. But anyway, politics are complicated. Reasons for optimism. Other states have done really amazing work around restorative justice legislation. Colorado kind of is at the top of that list. And they've been really generous in being accessible to me and to like our team here in Minnesota as we try to do the same type of legislation, or not the exact same, but following in their lead. So other states have done this, and we can do it too. Restorative justice is already really proliferating in Minnesota, including like in the metro area. the work that Beau is doing and Dr. Raj, and also in Greater Minnesota, Yellow Medicine County, Pine County, Polk County, I think. So many counties are really turning to restorative justice. And in, I guess maybe Yellow Medicine County is leading in this because they've been doing it for the longest, but doing it in a holistic way that's not just like there's criminal legal system and then there's restorative justice, but like looking at it more broadly. Growing diversity in the legislature, I think is helpful. Just, you know, less people who are like, this is the way it's always been done. And I've always been in the majority and in power and I'm fine with it. More people who have actually been impacted by the system and have reason to distrust systems and are interested in changing the dialogue and changing our systems. And then obviously we have a political moment. We have a trifecta and a $17.6 billion surplus. So we should take that for a spin and do really meaningful transformative work in this space. So, so those are reasons to be optimistic. And I think, is that my time? That was the end of my outline.
Yeah,
cool.
No, great, perfect timing. Thank you so much. And I see the chat coming alive, but let's just do a quick round of applause for our three presenters here. Fantastic stuff. Patrick's been monitoring the chat, and I think I see some really good questions coming up already. Minnesota Justice Research Center is the host today, and if you go to our website, you'll notice that one of the things we pride ourselves on is asking the hard questions, the difficult questions, right? Because, you know, iron sharpens iron, and this is going to make these practices better going forward. So we're not afraid of hard questions here for the rest of our session. So I am going to have moderator prerogative, and have the first question. And as Justin brought up during the welcome, the Star Tribune has talked a lot about restorative justice. And so our question is, as the Star Tribune recently reported, in Minnesota, restorative justice and other alternative approaches to handling youth crimes have been slow to gain public support. Minnesota has no uniform standards for who can participate in restorative justice programs, no guidelines about what the program should include, and little insight into whether they are working because outcomes like recidivism are not consistently tracked. So this question goes to Representative Feist. Do these bills, does the proposed Office of Restorative Justice address these concerns?
Hopefully. Like, they're complicated. I think the data collection in particular is really complicated because like recidivism is not defined in statute. And so when I was talking with the nonpartisan researcher about like what data can we collect, what is available, what is reasonable to put on local communities, that's incredibly complicated. But I mean, and the thing is also like, we're not looking for uniformity. We tried to create the structure of the bill is that there's this director of this office, and that person is going to be somebody like Dr. Raj, who has like restorative justice is in their bones. They are an expert, they are passionate, they are outspoken. Like, we want somebody like that at the helm. And then we have very specific parameters around local communities, that creating steering committees that are going to include community, include you know, a broad variety of voices that will then look at what are their needs, like truancy, like what are their specific community needs, what are their specific sensibilities, because like some, you know, like obviously a lot of programs already exist, but like if you go to Pine County, they're like, yeah, we already do this is awesome, you know, their county attorney is like all on board, and so like some counties are going to be ready to go. And then there are going to be other places in Minnesota where people don't have exposure to restorative justice and are going to be very uncomfortable. So like, we're not trying to create uniform standards. We're just like my vision for this is that it'll be like Yellow Medicine County, where they started out timid and small and tentative, but then they saw their small baby steps working in really dramatic ways, and slowly they expanded. Like, I think they moved from like crimes against property to like realizing that like assaults, you know, domestic violence, like more serious type of actions are the ones that even more desperately need like a restorative community-based approach. And so they just slowly got more comfortable and more expansive, and the system players gave up more power. And so my idea is that like through this office and through this reasonable mandate, that everyone across the state of Minnesota gets this opportunity to understand restorative justice and gets more comfortable with it, and it expands kind of organically. So that's the goal. I mean, it's a really complicated bill. Like, we just had a meeting yesterday where we're like, do we have to go back to the drawing board and like reconceptualize how we like structured it? But I don't know, like the key, I think, is just, I don't know, bringing in experts and listening to them and just trying to be thoughtful about it. So I don't know if that answered your question. I was basically like, no, it doesn't quite, but like it hopefully will ultimately. That is the goal.
Yeah, thank you. Chris Acosta put something in the chat about, finding more information. Beau and Raj, if you guys could put your information in the chat, make sure that's there so people can contact you about some of the specifics. But Patrick, I think we should go to the question from, is it Monsees Franco? I'm sorry, I mispronounced the name. That's a good question, don't you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Monsi is asking about restorative justice being holistic, as is Latanya. So we're looking to understand the components of restorative justice that are proactive, so that help a community be strong prior to the commission of crime, and hopefully through that reduce offenses committed. So if the panelists want to address how restorative justice can focus on healing before harm.
Yeah, Beau or Raj, can you talk a little bit about, it shouldn't just be reactive, right? You just can't wait till crimes happen and then react. How does this actually, is it a proactive practice?
I'm looking at you, Dr. Raj, because I feel like you hold some of these spaces.
No, I appreciate Beau. So part and parcel of this idea, right? So just the analogy, so those of us who garden, right? I'm the lousiest gardener, so y'all forgive me. I know Kara is like an expert in gardening. So the rest of you who garden, whenever we see something is wrong with the tomato plant and the tomato plant is not like coming up as well as you want to, and it's July, right? And it's approaching August, and you are like waiting for that fresh tomato. You don't take the plant and start to inject the plant with stuff, right? You often attend to what is going on in the environment where the plant is, and understanding the environment and adjusting to the environment and feeding nutrients to that particular plant will allow for that plant to flourish and bear fruit, right? The same idea applies in this work, right? When we understand that actions harm that are being produced, all of them, right, from a restorative transformative lens, we're saying that people are calling out, right, sending messages to you. They're saying something to you through their actions, right? As they say in the continent of Africa, that if a child does not feel the warmth of the village, he or she or they will burn down the village to feel the warmth, right? So the idea is, how are we listening to all of that call in our community? What are the different ailments that is producing the type of behavior patterns that we see in our communities? Somebody said, right, when parents are asking for their children to be in detention centers, a place so that their child can be protected, right? Why does the parent, right, look to detention center as the resort, as a place to work with the kid? What happened to prior ways of dealing with that? The prior times when the family is knocking on the system's door, or the child is knocking on the system's door through his or her or their action, often we forget to address all of those things. We wait for that crisis moment to hit us, and then we react, right? Our systems are built to react. Our enforcement and compliance systems that we have embedded and have funded for years have all been trained to react versus to reflect and restore, right? How are we reflecting, restoring, and responding to the call for the needs in our community? So that invites us to work at the roots, right? Repair the harm, address this historical intergenerational trauma that communities have experienced, right? We understand the impact of trauma today, right? More so than in the past. We never really wanted to, right? Now we have enough evidence-based practices out there that says that trauma is indeed, right, in people's bodies. So if it is in bodies and our children are showing up with all of these things, how are we taking time in our schools and respective spaces where our youth are present, right, to work through with them on all of these issues, as opposed to wait for that crisis to knock. And then we say, well, he or she or they is 14 years old, so we want to qualify them as an adult. Now you are facing 20 years and 25 years of prison, right? We as a village need to take that call for action whenever we hear these things, right? Just like the elephant's paw, when it hits the ground, it hears the call from its tribe. We are not positioned to hear the call for help. We are positioned to respond, react, right? So I want to invite us to think about this practice as upfront work, downstream work, and then, right? And then working through that deep healing work, right? This is about that roots work. And so the deep medicine practice that we need to indulge in has to have a staple of funding investment. That's why I appreciate what Representative Feist, right? I call it Rep Feist. Rep Feist is doing, right, in terms of investing and no longer just dangling carrots and say, well, you know, we'll give you some money and go do some work, right? And you can see us knowing the deep results that we are experiencing, and yet it is not systematically and structurally supported. So I want to invite us to think about how we are doing that work, right? In that work, right? Quick question, right? All of us come to our work with values, right? Grace, tell us what is the number one value that champions your work, that you bring to work? Grace Davis. Grace is like trying to hide in the dark.
Not really.
Well,
I think as an attorney, I'm trying to help my community.
Help, right? Help. So help communities has to have deep roots, right? Because you wrote that essay to get into law school, right? And you wanted to save the world in your essay, right? And we want you to bring that spirit to your work and not be hammered and into the systems and carry out the system's objectives, right? There's the native story, right, that says that systems often hire eagles that are soaring and has this beautiful views about our perspectives, and we hire them and then train them to be chickens, right? So let's stop doing that to our communities, to ourselves, to our bodies, because lawyers are walking out of places, teachers are walking out of classrooms with all kinds of wounds in their body and have no time to address them. So let us also work with the people in our system, right? The adults and everyone else, and not just position the child to be the person that we need to work with. We need to address harm across the board. Love y'all. Beau,
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, Raj, I think you're making a very important point there. And I heard it come up in your first discussion too, about just imposing restorative justice on teachers, right? And LaTanya has been really active in the chat. LaTanya gave me an earful yesterday for 57 straight minutes. And I think that was one of her main points, LaTanya, that we rarely talk to probation officers, we just impose. Here's what you're going to do. We rarely talk to teachers, we just impose. Here's what you're going to do. So LaTanya, maybe you could speak to this a little bit on how we make sure that we just don't show up in a school district and we say, okay, teachers, now you're doing restorative justice because Dr. Raj and Beau say so, right? So LaTanya, excuse me, LaTanya, do you want to speak to
Let me be sure to say, I never say that.
No, I know you would never say that, but it happens a lot. My wife is an elementary school teacher. It's happening, right? They're just coming in and saying, now we're doing restorative justice without any input from the teacher. So go ahead, LaTanya.
Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you, Will, for listening to my little rant yesterday. So it was kind of funny, it was kind of long. I definitely appreciate this conversation as someone who's went through restorative justice with my children and has sat there and watched the process and saw how beneficial it was. But then I saw when the community, being in my community, how it kind of stopped and then dropped the ball. And that wasn't the fault of anyone doing the restorative justice. It was just the service kind of stopped. And then what's next? And so I would love to see the part about what's next to make this actually work. When we're talking about being in the schools, for example, and talking to the teachers and saying, you're going to do this, that's always a hard rub. I'm a probation officer. It's a hard rub to come and say after the fact, well, you're going to do this without getting the input of people that are actually doing it. Those teachers are your partners. They are the second line of defense from the family. They know these kids, they see how they interact, they know what services they may need. For example, we have to be mindful of the subject matter experts being the family and those that have the most access to them. Then we have restorative justice programs that come in after the fact and say, oh, well, we think this is going to be the best thing. I like the idea of the circles. I think that someone mentioned earlier. We need to figure out how to get the people that are actually involved. There was an issue at my son's school where he got into it with some young lady, and I think blows were done. It was just a mess. But the teacher decided to do a restorative circle. And it's the first one I ever went to. And when I sat in the circle, the girl's mom was there, I was there, the kids that were there, we just kind of sat in the circle. We were able to hash out the issue amongst this circle. It was a very interesting experience, I must say. And I saw how it benefited my son to hear from a different perspective. And the young lady, she still had an attitude. But the administrator of the school said, well, your son at least processed what he heard. You can't change that she didn't want to hear what anyone had to say because she just had an attitude, whatever was going on with her. But her mom was receptive. So just the thought that they tried to do it, correct? So I think that with the teachers, they said, well, we need to do this. This is a way we can get this situation resolved. The teachers is the one that set this up. And I would have never known anything about it. So again, we have to get the subject matter experts being the people that are most around these kids to get them involved. The one that I went to previously with my older son, there was no one but some lady that I met for the first time ever sat in the room. And he was challenged the way this was done. He didn't care for it too much. He kind of just went through the process to kind of check the box, right? But the fact that no one in the room that he knew but me, that was a challenge for him, trying to tell some Caucasian woman that he had no idea about his business. She tried to tell him, you need, the pointing the finger. That didn't go over quite so well. So I saw the kind of two different ways that we did this, and I just saw the benefit of one over the other, right? And so that was because you included the subject matter experts, the teachers holistically, the people that were involved in these kids' lives so that they can process. So when the one child wasn't quite listening, the mama said, wait a minute, hold on now. And the teacher said, wait a minute, she needs to do it this way. It was very, very inclusive. So we just needed to include people. I think this is a very good model. I really like the restorative justice practices. I do think there's some things that can be tweaked, like anything that we do in life, but really getting people involved in this process. We'll get buy-in from people to actually want to send someone here, because like Mr. Will said, when we're talking about justice, people are getting the system involved and kind of give them the take their little thumbs off of it, right? So that they can want to do something like this. We have to start from the top down, as opposed to just saying, you're going to do this because we said so, and then that's the option. Because again, once restorative justice is over and that little circle is done, then what? Because the family still got to deal with that child who lack resources, don't have what they need, and they're already fighting the system and fighting their kids' behavior at the same time. Like I said in the chat, it's exhausting. And I've been through this many, I couldn't even tell you, I won't bore y'all with the details, how often I've been through this process. And so we just gotta be real mindful of that. So thank you. I appreciate
this is the first time, y'all, that LaTanya and I see eye to eye.
This is true, because we don't.
Down, right? We love each other.
Yes.
We're in the same place, but yes.
Yes.
And I'll say that a lot of what LaTanya just shared is part of why Hennepin County Probation institutionalized the YRJDP, because they were an active part of it. And that was like a decision that was made, and they're a part of the circles. And so we had seed money to get it started. And then the next year, they're like, we want to make this, we want to invest in this while still keeping the contracts with community-based circle keepers. I'll say something that I've learned from Greater Minnesota, though, because the Twin Cities is not necessarily getting everything right or like doing the best and all that. And I recognize that there's like a bias at play and who gets to take up airspace in these conversations. The other thing that you brought up, LaTanya, that I felt like was really important is like it's not restorative to identify needs that then don't get met. And sometimes the systematizing of processes, and even I've struggled with this, is like, we don't have an emergency fund because we found out that this family is barely making mortgage each month, or, you know, this X, Y, or Z, like the truancy issue is not going to end, or like the only available transportation is Metro Mobility through the grandmother. Like, I'm not interested in like facilitating just the relationship repair with the school if we're not getting to this. And talking to somebody who's a practitioner at Red Lake, who's an Anishinaabe, talked about how their tribe just has fun. So if they find out that there's bed bugs, that becomes the thing that gets handled. We're not trying to have this conversation that's going to facilitate healing if like XYZ hasn't been handled because people can't be present to it. So I just want to name that, like, that's something that I've been interested in too, is how can we make sure that there's like funds, or like how can we create some abundance so that while we're trying to take care of the relationships, we're also not just like skirting over these needs, or, oh, I only get 90 days because the partner that we're the system that we're partnering with, that's how long we get to work with you. I want to walk with families in Florida, and when I talk to Yellow Medicine and talk to Red Lake practitioners, they're like, oh yeah, there's not like a time limit on when we're working with. And that's why it's hard, because there's all these like linear processes. And I'm like, that's not equity. If I spend only the same amount of time with this kid and this kid, like that's not necessarily meeting their needs. Not all the kids are facing the same barriers.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue back to Representative Feist, because I see the chat's alive here. And I think this is one of the themes that, as the panelists pointed out right away, our wallet is always open for the criminal justice system. We pour money into it. The problem that I think a lot of people are seeing with restorative justice is it's being done on the cheap, right? Or the resources are not, we're doing restorative justice, but we're not providing the necessary resources to actually get it done. How do you think these bills that you mentioned are going to address those situations, Representative Feist?
Well, it's the main reason that I wanted to be vice chair of public safety, was to fight for that type of funding, because I was torn between education finance vice chair, because I'm also passionate about really wonky technical aspects of our education budget. But I felt like there were other people in that space, and I felt like if I was in the public safety sphere, I could advocate more powerfully to shift some of that funding and to look beyond traditional kind of concepts of public safety. And I work really closely with Representative Cedric Frazier on just that advocacy. So his bill, I forget how much money it was, but he had sort of a mini version of the really big innovation package that he had from last year. And that includes funding for restorative justice and just more sustained funding for community-based, supports that would address public safety and also just address inequity in Minnesota. And then I have House File 1712, I put in chat. House File 46 is the Office of Juvenile Restorative Justice. And just in general, I'm trying to take up space in the discussion to push back against just those traditional kind of approaches and investments. Like I was talking with the Commissioner of Public Safety about the budget high level, and he said, I think it was like $12 million for like violent crime prevention or something. And I was like, so like restorative justice, like community-based interventions, like he's like, no, we're gonna have a bunch of analysts. And we're going to pay $12 million for them, and then we'll solve violent crime. And I was like, I feel like there are better ways to solve violent crime. So I think, I know so the way that it works in general is that we'll have these big omnibus bills, and in the Senate, public safety and judiciary are together in one committee. In the House, they're separate, but we're all, or I guess, I shouldn't say we're all reformers, but we're like majority reformers, I think, on both sides, both Senate and House on those committees. And so when we'll be developing our budget with those voices in the room, and then we'll be negotiating our budget between the House and the Senate with those voices in the conversation. And so I'm like, just the way it works is I will get to be part of the conference committee, I think. I don't think there's a scenario where I'm not, because I'm vice chair. And so I'll just be really pushing hard. Like my House File 1712 just has dots for how much money. because I just want to put as much money as possible into that space. And actually, I'm trying to get the Chiefs of Police Association to formally endorse it. And they were like, well, how much money? Because we want to make sure our stuff gets funded too. And I was like, you don't have to talk about the money part. Just say like you acknowledge that these types of investments are meaningful investments in public safety, and I'll be happy. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of bills out there that try to funnel money into community and away from kind of just our traditional approaches to public safety that obviously they're not making us safer, and they're incredibly unjust. So yeah, I'm excited to be pushing in that direction.
Raj, you would like to chime in as well?
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, you know, when we think about experts coming in and analyzing and saying, okay, this is how we're going to reduce crime, right? And we have done all of that, right? We have invested in smart policing, y'all, right? That is a thing of the past. We have already explored how do we reduce crime through this analysis, and what this analysis failed to tell us, as Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark, who did the doll test, and when they were invited to the Kerner Commission in the 1960s, right? The Kerner Commission report comes out and says that the problem is not about fixing policing, it is about understanding the needs in our community. But it was never addressed. What happened to that commission's report? It's set in the library somewhere and collected dust, right? And to this day, we are trying to fix our criminal justice systems, our correction systems, our police systems, our judicial systems, and recognizing that our judicial system is imbued with biases, right? Left and right and center. And yet we keep relying on these 400, 500-year-old systems on a regular basis without really exploring what are we really missing? Where are our communities? As Latanya said, right? Who are in the front line? Our parents are in the front line, right? Our teachers are in the front line. Our nurses are in the front line, who are witnessing all kinds of harm that is happening in our community. And yet we keep pouring money into a system that continuously fail us, right? As Alex Vitale said, right, the end of policing. There is a time where we need to wrest this idea of trying to police and arrest ourselves out of these problems. It is time for us to address, right? How do we become a society, a community that is working towards abolition and liberation? How do we focus on people's wellness? I want Rep Feist and others to think about how much money, right, collectively out of this $19 billion, right, more than 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 countries put together their GDP. We are a state of what, 5.5 million people, right? And how do we invest in that frontline needs so that we firmly, right, elevate people and their lives and their well-being? Let us focus on public wellness, right? Let's for one rest public safety. Love y'all.
And I think that people are afraid, like we've measured a million things, like you said, Dr. Raj. And I think also people are afraid to give money because of examples where people have abused power. And if we continue to key our decision-making to the lowest behavior, we will never build a culture of trust. And so the risk, it's been too, it's the same thing. There's too many prosecutors who are judges and not enough public defenders. It's that imbalance of that risk that someone might cause harm if you give them another chance versus risking that you're taking liberty from another human being. That imbalance in how we make decisions. We have to take risks on our youth. We have to take risks on our community. We can't like not offer gift cards or whatever because somebody like went ham on them. Like, because I've talked to youth workers, I've talked to different people who certain resources have disappeared because of abuses of power. And then, but that's not helping the people who are, you know, genuinely in need when they ask. And we already have so many eligibility hoops. Like I'm just thinking of a specific family I applied for home help with in August and still hasn't received and is very much eligible. They didn't even have to prove their income because that program had identified that that zip code explicitly was eligible on principle. If we know that, we know who the people are that need. So like we got to do something about that. So that when I'm thinking about how we're like shaping this bill or other things, let's use the information that we have. It's not a mystery who, like a lot of the county attorney's office have identified, you know, it's like this 22 kids or something that they're seeing. So then like, it's not a mystery. If we can call them by name, then we should be able to be circling up. And to the point about teachers and spaces that are not necessarily kind of hopping around here, feel free to rein me in. But I was thinking about as an organization that does a lot of this cohort work with the high turnover districts, we see that conflict of admin deciding, and that has to do with the hierarchical decision making and that these are colonial institutions. And the reality is that we end up holding circles often between staff because of that harm, or feeling like districts have held a space but not set a clear intention. So they think there's going to be action and then there's not, but they really just wanted to hold space to process something intense that happened in the building. And that lack of clarity and then that high turnover makes people blame restorative practices or say that they're ineffective, but it's really because power was not shared. It was not power with. And so, yes, it failed, but let's not blame culture, like this return to culture for why that's happening. It's the adults needing to do better about how they move together and move more slowly.
Feist, you went off mute there for a second. Did you want to chime in?
I forget. I had something brilliant to say.
Okay. Oh,
Can't
I'm sure it
remember
was.
what
Yeah, we'll come back. So I want to note that Patrick has put some important stuff in there in the chat about where to find out more about restorative justice and some information on the bills. But this was sent to me. The question about, is the Office of Restorative Justice separate from the criminal justice system? Does it walk alongside the criminal justice system? I'm getting, you know, Beau talked a little bit about this, how you do work with Hennepin County and probation. And I think people would like more clarity if this is like a auxiliary of the criminal justice system, if it's something completely separate, how that would work. I assume there has to be some interaction.
Well, so we struggle with this because, like I said, like we ultimately do want it to be its own thing and not necessarily like just an alternative to like traditional sentencing. And my hope is that it ultimately can become that for communities as they get exposure. Initially, we had housed it within the Department of Human Services. And everyone, including the Department of Human Services, was like, no. They were like, don't, we're huge and unwieldy and we don't know anything about this and we don't have enough money and you couldn't give us enough money to do it. And everyone yelled at me. So that was that. There is hopefully going to be a new Department of Youth. I keep forgetting what it's called. It's like Children, Youth, and Families or something like that. I'm going to fight really hard for that to become a reality because I think that is where this and all like juvenile justice should live. For now, it's going into Department of Public Safety, which is not perfect. And that kind of comes back to our imperfect agencies and imperfect systems that we have to, you know, if we want to do something statewide, we have to do it within the framework that we have. And that seems to be the only way that the system will accept our idea. like not only does it seem like it wouldn't be workable within Department of Human Services, but I think like everyone would do their very best to just kill it. And so I think we have an actual chance of doing it this way. And the way that we've written an updated version of the bill is that would automatically transfer to that Department of Youth, Family, and Children. We have tried to create these steering committees, like very specific parameters around the steering committees to make sure that, and we had this good discussion about this yesterday, to try to make sure we're empowering other actors and experts and community members outside of just like Department of Public Safety, Office of Justice programs, like to give them a voice in terms of what it will look like, where the funding will go. And so, you know, I'm hopeful that the way we're structuring it, my goal with the way we're structuring it is that it's not just an offshoot of public safety. But I do think that another reason that having it in public safety makes strategic sense is I have more power there. And I think that there's more of an interest in investing in restorative justice in that context. Like the health and human services budget is so ginormous. Like if we were like, also restorative justice, they'd be like, we are busy with all the other things that are already on our plate. So public safety is an area where there's just a lot of interest and a lot of activity. So that's where it's going to live for now. I think my hope is that we'll have this new department. The way the bill will be written is it'll automatically transfer, and then trying to put in those safeguards so that we depower the system and the agency and empower the community will hopefully address some of those concerns. And we're working really hard on language that will make it clear that it doesn't it isn't just like a public safety thing, that it is a bigger thing about like youth wellness, not just, like I had a conversation the other day where somebody kept talking about dangerous juveniles. And I'm like, oh, your language hurts my soul. Like this is not about dangerous juveniles. Like it's about kids, hurting kids that we want to help. So we're trying our best to structure it in that way.
If I may, Representative Feist, you know me, so I'm just going to be honest with you. Public safety is no place for restorative practices, right? I don't want to rest it there at all, because we have designed public safety on Black and brown bodies, right? The history of policing, the history of criminal justice system, a lot of these systems that we continue to rely on has racialized past and continues to have racism within the practices, right? Within the practices, with the exception of Sister LaTanya Reeves, right? That we still have that imbued in the system to such extent that sometimes all of these reforms that we keep introducing into reforming criminal justice systems, into reforming corrections, into reforming law enforcement, have never really given birth to a transformation that we are looking for. So towards that end, I will say outright in public that, right, and Dr. Madsen, who is one of the greatest practitioners of this practice, right, will also vouch for me and say that we totally disagree. It's sitting in a place where we have continuously harmed our Black and brown bodies, especially, right? It is time for us to think about overall the village and the community's wellness, and how are we investing in that wellness and work towards an abolitionist and liberation future versus reliant and perpetuating a system that is built on racism, that is built on prejudices and biases, that continues to punish Black and brown bodies disproportionately, right? Even in the state of Minnesota, right? You have per capita more people on probation and parole in the state of Minnesota, right? We are one of the top 20 when it comes to the number of people on probation and parole, right? Along with how many people, 48%, 35 to 48% of the people in our prison systems are Black, right? Are Black bodies, right? 10% indigenous bodies, right? Our overall population don't stand up to that. So we are not fundamentally addressing the basic needs in our community, right? If we rest this in the public safety, we are now going to be confined to this idea that unless and until there's violations, there's a crime, we cannot release those funds. I say, shut the front door, get out of my face. I want this funding to be liberated and in our community, not sitting with some decision makers who have no clue what is happening in our streets, right? So that's where I am.
Go ahead, Representative Feist.
Yeah, I hear you. And I wish that we could do this in like a pure way. I think that the decision we have is like, do we do this at all? And if we want to do it at all, I think this is the way we have to start doing it, with kind of an acknowledgement that it is an imperfect situation, a perfect solution. I do think that our ability to invest in community and in restorative justice will be elevated by taking the approach of the House File 46. Like, we can have like a deeper conversation about whether we just don't bother. Because I do think like we're much more likely to get significant amount of funding for the types of programs that we both do believe in and support on the House File 46 path than the House File 1712 path, which I also feel deeply passionate about. You know, I think the fact that like the Star Tribune has multiple times been elevating this effort, I think it's bringing more attention to it and more energy behind it in the legislature and in the community that can get us to our ultimate goal. So I think, and this is like a deep conversation we're having in public, and we can continue it in private, but I am personally a very pragmatic person, and I want to take steps that are meaningful and principled that get us to our ultimate goal. And I am comfortable in a space where we are doing it in an impure way that I feel isn't like, you know, totally selling out all of our values and all of our goals. Like, and I feel like putting it in Office of Justice programs with the end goal of putting it in this Department of Youth, Family, and Children is a path that I am comfortable with and I feel is still very much worthwhile. And from all of the conversations I've had with other folks, like nobody has said to me, let's just not bother if we can't put it in human services. But I'm willing to have that conversation too, because obviously, like I've said at the beginning, like you and Beau and most of the folks here are experts, or maybe everyone here besides me is an expert. So, you know, I don't pretend to be that expert, but my understanding is that what we can do here is meaningful and a step in the right direction that will not be destructive, but that will be imperfect, but that it will help elevate this funding and the attention and restorative justice in Minnesota. But yeah. I hear you, I really do.
No, let me, I know, Beau, you may want to chime in. I just want to say, if pragmatism has helped to sustain an oppressive system, then I don't want to be pragmatic. I want to be real.
Yeah.
I want to be with my community, right? Because Black and brown and bodies have been subjected to systems of oppression in the name of pragmatism, in the name of efficiency, in the name of public safety, often. And we continue to perpetuate that even in the time of surplus, right? We have so much money sitting there that needs to be invested. It is time for reparation. It is time for investment in our communities, right? Let us not take that short path in the name of pragmatism and efficiency, y'all. I love you, Rep. Feist. We know we good, right? Mm-hmm. But I appreciate, I just want to stand by that.
Yeah, and this is a really important conversation. I think we continue to have it, right? I mean, we're not going to solve it right here today, but this is, our series is called Continuing the Conversation. And because, you know, I think there's so many things, and I see Beau wants to chime in on this as well, that come up. I mean, I have to admit, Representative Feist, when I first saw the first draft and it was in Health and Human Services, I had a minor heart attack because I thought that's such a giant operation already that can barely keep its house in order, right? So, but I think there's pluses and minuses to an independent office, but you know, Raj, you brought up net widening at the beginning. Every time we set up a new independent office, we widen the net and people go and find new cases, right? So there's danger in independent bureaucracies. More bureaucracy isn't always the answer. Beau, go ahead and chime in.
I just wanted to name like a lot of, I'm green to these processes, and a number of us who had been a part of a work group had done some exploring to figure out like what's the proper framing for youth, and did some exploring with the Department of Public Health and asking questions and really looking at safe harbor as one of the first times that it seemed like youth, families, people were being, and like predominantly, yeah, Black and brown bodies and Indigenous bodies were being decriminalized in a very specific way, and that being an opportunity to expand that framework. So I just like continue to remain curious about that and that opportunity. I just wanted to name that in this conversation.
Great, thank you. So when we planned this event, it was 2 hours because we thought we were going to be in person and we wanted a whole lot of chance for networking and talking to each other and moving around the room. So we're not going to fill up the whole 2 hours for the CLE content. We've got the good 65 minutes that we needed. I do want to turn it over to quickly to Patrick to anything from the chat, but there's one last question, and this goes for, and this is an elevator speech, right, for all three panelists, because I think there's a lot of people in the room that are really friendly to the concept of restorative justice. But let's picture expanding this. Let's picture you need to talk to someone in Little Falls. You need to talk to someone in Worthington. You need to talk to someone in Polk County. How would you get across that restorative justice is the path forward? So Patrick, first, anything from the chat?
Yeah, if it's all right, I just wanted to synthesize some of the folks' comments and questions. I think a lot of this chat has really been about the village and about involving the community. And we heard a lot about, implementing a restorative justice office and processes from Representative Feist. And again, I think something is always better than nothing in this direction. But I think it's also important, and Dr. Raj and Beau can address this, is how do we begin ourselves collectively as a community begin to integrate this locally? How do we develop our own systems of restorative justice? As Kara asked, are systems able to implement RJ with integrity? And we're going to find out when the Restorative Justice Office is created. But prior to that point, what are we doing here now? What can be done? Where do we go? And how are we inclusive of these processes here at home in our neighborhoods? So yeah, if any of the panelists want to address that, I think that would resolve some of the questions from a lot of the people in the chat.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue to the elevator statement, right? I mean, here's what we're doing here in Ramsey County. Here's what we're doing in Hennepin County. Here's why it'll work in Little Falls. Here's why it's going to work in Worthington. So maybe we can wrap up by having all three panelists really give us that elevator speech. Raj, are you capable of that elevator speech? Is that in your wheelhouse?
What are you trying to say, Will?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I am not capable of giving you an elevator speech because this is not, the practice itself does not, right, cannot be zoomed in from 30,000 feet, right? It has to be in the ground. It has to be in the water, right? So this is not an elevator speech. This is a humble request for us to say, start with your own self, right? Practice that mindfulness on a regular basis, right? Ground yourself. Don't just go to yoga class and relieve all those stresses. And then when you come out, treat the community like they don't exist, right? Take that practice from the yoga studios and bring it into your communities, right? Don't let that be defined by the Lululemon spans, but rather, right, how Grace is like, oh shit, he's calling me out. But really, how do we bring it into the streets and really look to start to see human beings, right? And exercise that practice Ubuntu in our streets, right? Be able to see each other's humanity and not let the systems, right, shift us, pivot us from the focus on the humanity onto just the action and the behavior. We tend to focus on the behavior that takes away from the grounded humanity that is in front of us, and how do we directly work with them and their needs, right? So my hope, my humble request to anybody who's listening, you can dismiss me and say that mofo is talking crazy, right? You can do it. I've heard it all, right? I've heard it all. So bring it, right? Say all those things, but go home and breathe and understand that restoration of your own body is the starting point for this practice, and then start to elevate that into the communities, into the professions that you are a part of, right? And start to not perpetuate and try to fix systems that have been fundamentally, historically built to produce harm, right? There is no reason for us to try to sustain safety models in our communities, right? This public safety concept. It is time for us to, right, settle it in a museum and start to work towards humanizing our work so that our communities, especially Black and brown bodies that have historically and generationally and today experiencing all kinds of harm, can be lifted and liberated to imagine, right? To dream and to have goals. Love y'all. I'll pass it on to Beau.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Raj. I always appreciate your passion and your wisdom. First person I met when I moved back to Minnesota that was in the criminal justice sphere. And I think that shows how active he is. Beau.
Thank you, Dr. Raj. Okay, so I just want to reground in what I'm speaking to. So I am talking about how we can accomplish this.
Yeah,
like
make your elevator speech to folks, right? This Office of Restorative Justice spreading across the state. Why you would say this, you should try this. Just a few sentences.
Like support that or just as an individual? Sorry, I just want to make sure.
Yeah, well, sure. Yeah, I think as an individual, you're trying to convince people, right?
Yeah, I mean, focus on your healing. I would echo a lot of what Dr. Raj said. We have a lot of walking wounded adults. A lot of us, I've seen judges say, how are you going to punish your child when they're upset that this 11-year-old was found incompetent to proceed and they want something to happen, and all I can think is who hurt you. So I think that being on your path of healing and thinking about how discipline and things have played out in your lives, they disproportionately affect Black and brown bodies. And also, like, my family was impacted by these things too. And if white people don't start to feel a sense of solidarity and how these punitive systems hurt us and cause us to continue to hurt each other. So that's like one piece. The other piece I would think is like small things often, small is all. So like now when I'm facilitating, if I'm facilitating a space, I do try to move away from agendas and do a values round first. Make sure everybody is heard, make sure that I'm slowing down what I'm doing so that, and if somebody wants to pass, that's fine. But I try to bring the principles of restorative practices to different spaces. Making a handshake with every kid in your classroom is restorative. Like, it's not just a shape, and the shape can also have punitive interactions depending on how people show up. So I guess it would just be like, yeah, I think it's about thinking about that. And then I'm trying to think about reclaiming the word safety, reclaiming the word accountability. That doesn't get to be defined by carceral people. Public safety doesn't belong to people who have held all this privilege. So I think that that's a small thing you can do, is be like, actually, I get to decide, I get to define that. That is not imposed on me. Property is not more important than people. Yeah, I think narrative is really important in storytelling. So telling stories that show that transformation, if you've gotten to be a part of a space that's restorative, sharing that story. And talking about how restorative practices, I know one of the questions is about why it matters. It's like cycle breaking, it's long-term, it's sustainable, it restores agency, it provides space for grieving. Those are all reasons that we should do that. We do not, our adversarial system is not a truth-seeking process. It tries to find a singular truth, and that doesn't exist where harm happens. And I think that that's something to point out, is that if there are such painful moments I've witnessed in court in juvenile trials where there could have been a moment for healing, but they're both trying to protect their position, so they don't get to have that. And they're not even directly addressing each other, and they're crying. And that's not healing, that's re-traumatizing. So just, yeah, reclaim the narrative, reshape, reframe, focus on your healing. That's what I have.
Thank you. And we'll go to Representative Feist, and then we have closing comments from Justin Terrell, our Executive Director.
Cool. Thanks. So I was thinking about like, how do we do big things collectively? And I was thinking about the way that I try to approach everyone that I work with and everyone around me is to be open, to listen, to assume good intentions and good motives and good hearts. In the legislature, like just yesterday, there were like 2 things I'm working on where there was like a lot of swirling people, like rumors and conjecture and just like always like grounding yourself in the sense that we're all trying to do the best we can to achieve the same goals of like a more just system and a more just state of Minnesota. So I always try to be open, listen, and assume the best in people. And I think that's important when you're collaborating on meaningful things like this Office of Juvenile Restorative Justice, like it's complicated. And we need to like assume that we're all in this space for the same reason, even if we have different perspectives. Another thought that came to mind is we did this exercise at our DFL retreat where we categorized ourselves into like different categories, and they were the truth tellers, the bridge builders, the like front man, and the policy wonks. And it helped us to kind of understand that we all have different roles to play as a team, and they're all equally important. And it helped me to like not judge. Like I was trying not to judge people, but it helped me to be like, I have my role. Like my role is kind of like half policy wonk, half bridge builder. But we can't all be policy wonk bridge builders. Like some of us have to be like burn the system down, and like all of us bring those skills to the conversation to like affect change. And so I think understanding that is important as we move forward towards like systems change. And lastly, I was just thinking about I think a lot about the fallacy of sunk cost, which is the idea that like once you've put in a certain amount of time and effort and money into something, like you have to see it through. And so I think we always need to be like introspective and thinking deeply about the work we're doing and why we're doing it, and is it where we should be putting our time and our energy. And so like just always being flexible, I think is really important in policymaking and in just like changing the world. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that, but it's been a pleasure being here with all of you today.
Yes, thank you so much to the panelists. I'm going to turn it over to Justin Terrell, our Executive Director.
Thank you, Representative Feist. Thank you, Dr. Raj. Thank you, Beau RaRa. Will, great job facilitating and pulling this together. Patrick, I appreciate your support on the call as well. I just want to say thank you to everyone who took time to be with us this morning. I'm just going to be honest with this exchange. It's, you know, we try to build bridge builders here at the MNJRC. We understand people don't always agree. We don't require people to agree. We just want to trust the data and figure out what is the best path forward. But I'm also reminded, I'll just tell a quick story. I'm reminded of my son this morning as he was going back to school, told me that about it's Black History Month. So he's learning about Hank Aaron and a bunch of other, you know, Black leaders. And one of them is Harriet Tubman. And my favorite story about Harriet Tubman is when there was some slaves who were being taken back to the South that she had been a part of freeing. And there was one left, right, that was going to be put on this boat. And she goes to her allies and they're like, we can't risk our movement for one person. And so she just goes to the town. She sees the man being brought out in chains. She wraps her arms around this man and starts screaming, drag us to the river. Don't let him, no matter what, just don't let him take him on a boat. And she like risked her life, risked the life of others, and to save this one person. And I'm reminded by that story because I'm not going to pretend like everyone on this call who feels desperately that we have to end oppression of our people today. I'm not going to pretend, and y'all can't pretend that you Harriet Tubman. But we can recognize that we need that spirit, and that those of us who are willing to put it on the line have to be willing to put it on the line. And the rest of us have other roles to play as well. My goal is to make sure that Harriet never has to go down to the river and get that one slave by herself again. And that's the purpose of these conversations, to make sure that we all recognize the struggle ahead of us, to make sure that we all recognize the different roles we play, and to build that alignment so that the struggle doesn't have to fall on one person to risk their lives to save another, but that all of us are in the struggle together. And so we're going to disagree, and I love it. I love it. We want all the smoke over here. We want to disagree. We want to argue. We want to wrestle through real problems. And there is so much that we agreed on this call. And that gives me hope, and that gives us a path forward. And I just believe that we can figure this out together and become an example to the rest of the nation of what justice looks like in the state of Minnesota. And so with that, I just want to say thank you for your time, your dedication, your investment in our organization. Please feel free to continue to support us and call on us. We are at your service, and we'll be leading more conversations like this in the future. I don't think we have any announcements, so I think we're just going to wrap it up there. And I'll just say, check on your people, go shovel some snow, and just be kind to each other. Blessings.